Now let's go over to Texas and take a look at conflict between Tejanos and Anglo-Texans in that region. Now, conflict in that region was happening for a number of different reasons. A lot of the conflict was over land, right? We talked a little bit about how Anglo-Texans were pushing Tejanos off of their land through violence and intimidation. But you also have a lot of issues over cattle theft. You had Mexican raiders, many of them coming from Mexico, and raiding the lands of Anglo-Texans and taking their cattle. Right, and then selling that cattle either back in Mexico or to other individuals in South Texas. And so there was this big illegal cattle trade going on. And so Anglo-Texans reacted to this by retaliating with vigilante committees, right? Same thing as another form of vigilante groups. And so you've seen a lot of lynchings of Tejanos going on during this time, whether they were guilty or whether they were innocent of stealing cattle. And you got to understand, this is a lot of cattle being stolen, right? Over 100,000 heads of cattle being stolen. And so that's a lot of cattle to be lost. And so you see why Anglo-Texans are upset and why they're forming these vigilante groups. But still, this is outside the law, and they're persecuting people sometimes that are completely innocent. They're not proving conclusively that these people had anything to do with stealing this cattle. All right, and so that's the problem with vigilante groups. And so you have a lot of violence being perpetrated against Tejanos at this time because of this. All right, so as I mentioned, there were a lot of raids, cattle raids, happening with raiders coming across the border from Mexico. We talked a little bit about this already. Remember, we were talking about Juan Cortina and the Cortinistas, his group, his followers, people that were influenced by Juan Cortina. And a lot of these raids were blamed on Juan Cortina, whether he was actually, taking part in the raids or not. And so this has led to a lot of violence being perpetrated against Tejanos because of these raids coming from Mexico. And these raids are resulting in the theft of a lot of cattle on the land of Anglo-Texans. And remember, this land was taken illegally at times, right, by Anglo-Texans who were forcing Tejanos off of their lands. And so it's a conflict going back and forth between the two groups. Another example of how these raids led to violence against Tejanos was the attack that occurred on Nueces Town. The attack on Nueces Town was perpetrated by Anglo-Texans who burned the town and killed at least 100 Mexican Americans in this town, and this was all in retaliation for the raids that were occurring on Anglo-Texan land, right? The theft of cattle. Another example of violence between Tejanos and Anglo-Texans was the Salt War. The Salt War took place in the county of El Paso in southern Texas. Now, the Salt War was over access to salt. There were natural salt deposits in that area, and Mexican Americans who had lived there for a long period of time had free access to these salt deposits, right? So if you needed salt, you didn't go to a grocery store, you go to this mountain area and you get your salt, right? Just free, natural resource, right? Because that was considered community land. Okay, it was for the community, and so the community could go to these lands and they can access the salt there whenever they needed it for free. Eventually, an Anglo-Texan by the name of Charles Howard tried to gain ownership of these salt deposits, and he was going to charge Mexican Americans for accessing this salt. And so he met with resistance. Hundreds of Mexican Americans in the area banded together and resisted having to pay for this salt. The Texas Rangers got involved. There was violence that occurred. Eventually, the Rangers were forced to retreat from the area. But the Mexican-American victory didn't last for long. Eventually, other U.S. forces were sent into the region to stop the Salt War, and many Mexican-Americans fled to other areas, even across the border into Mexico, in order to escape that violence, right? So the Salt War is just another example of Anglo-Texans attempting to gain control of the land and resources, Mexican-Americans trying to fight back and resisting, but ultimately they did lose access to those salt deposits and were charged for accessing salt in the future. Another example of oppression of Tejanos and false accusations of crimes would be the case of Gregorio Cortez. Cortez was falsely accused of stealing a horse. He was going to be arrested by a sheriff, and he was protesting, saying, I had nothing to do with this. But because of the language barrier, the sheriff ended up pulling a gun and shooting his brother. Cortez ends up shooting that sheriff and escaping, and he goes on the run. Right, he goes on the run for a period of time, and he becomes this big folk hero among Mexican Americans at the time because he's fighting back against this unfair legal system. Right, and so he is on the run for a period of time. Eventually, Cortez will be captured and put in jail, and he gets a life sentence. But he will eventually be pardoned because he's such a model inmate. And he really didn't commit a crime. It was just a confusion. It was a mistake. So eventually he gets pardoned in 1913, right? And so he's an example of resistance, Tejano resistance against the oppression of the legal system working against them during this time in Texas.